Hey, hello, here we go. Chapter 25 on non-economic values. A little overview of the Thomas Sowell reading. And so we've got our questions right up there. Why is economics referred to as the dismal science? What are non-economic values? Why is it mistaken to refer to or to equate economics and values? Okay, so this chapter, he's going to non-economic values. First of all, the dismal science, that's economics. Economics is a dismal science, and he refers to it that way because he says that economics tends to, quote unquote, pour cold water on attractive and exciting ideas because as exciting and attractive as an idea is, uh, it can be fallacious. It can be wrong. Wishful thinking, we call it. And he says people don't like economists because they tend to kind of bring in reality. Yes, we wish this were the case. Yes, we intended for that to happen. But economics tend to say, well, here's what's actually going to take place, or here's why things are happening the way they are. And that can kind of be a downer. Like, hey, let's do this. And then economics comes in and dismally says, well, if we do that, here's what's actually going to really happen. Or here's what it's really going to take. Or there aren't enough scarce resources with alternative uses for both of those plans to work, or whatever. And so they're kind of kind of Debbie Downers or the dismal science because they're focused on facts and reality, and that's not the same as feelings and aspirations. Um, and so, what are non-economic values then? Is he says then non-economic values are basically an argument for factors beyond facts. That they're things to consider when making decisions or what you're shooting for that are more like ideals or principles. And he says a lot of times they'll be used as a counter argument to, yes, I know that the economics of the situation says this, but there's a higher non-economic value that we have to consider. And it seems that, yeah, he says it's oftentimes considered more noble or important than, say, just crass materialism. That economists are just caught up in the numbers and the facts and the figures and the statistics. Whereas we need to also be sure we consider non-economic values of our principles and ideals. And he says a lot of times, frankly, they're used to excuse irrationality. In other words, I know this doesn't make sense. I know that it doesn't add up factually, but I'm going to do it anyway because I'm being driven by this non-economic value. And he says people tend to be much more persuaded by non-economic values a lot of times than the facts on the ground because we are at our heart aspirational creatures. And he says, but another point he makes is it's important not to equate economics and values because he says all values are non-economic. He actually says there's nothing, and it says he wouldn't even he's not saying we shouldn't follow our ideals or have principles or any of those things. He just says, just realize economics is not a value. Economics is a science of how something happens or why something is happening. The values then answer the why question, like, or the should, like, why should we do something, or what should we do, or what is the right thing? And we need those things. Economics doesn't answer the moral question. Economics just says, well, here's what's going to happen in a world governed by scarce resources with alternative uses. And so he kind of the proper, would be to just realize you're going to have the economics to tell you what's going on, and then your values are going to have to decide how you respond to that reality. And he goes out some length in the chapter talking about cold, hard economists who are for free market and laissez-faire capitalism, who then nonetheless, use that to make a lot of money, but then in their private lives had values of charity and generosity, and sharing, and tried to use their wealth for good things. And he said that's their values at stake, and that are in practice, and that's separate from their adherence to purely economic facts on the ground. In other words, economics doesn't tell us what we should do, only what will happen in different cases of what we decide to do. And we see that a lot of times Thomas Sowell, he'll refer to, feudalism, communism, socialism, and the free market. He'll say they're all economic systems, but the economics will tell you what's going to happen in each of those systems, and then we have to decide based on our values which one we're going to go with. Okay, so then question number two, why should economics and not politics be considered the art of the possible? And that just really builds upon question number one, and that economics is, a study of the distribution of scarce resources that have alternative uses. And so, in other words, here's what we have, here's how things work, here's how people behave, here's what's going to happen. So here's what's possible. We've got so many resources. We only have so much money. We only have so much uh, uh, slices of pizza. Here's what's possible, what we can do with what we have. Whereas, and he says that, so that, in some sense, again, that's why it's kind of dismal, because it doesn't, it kind of breaks to reality. Okay, here's your options. Whereas politics, he says, even though it's the one typically called the art of the possible, he says in a way it's not very much like that, because it tends to often stray from reality. Politicians and their speeches and what they're saying tend to be more built upon people's values or their desires or their intentions, what they want to have happen, what they wish were true. We all kind of wish the world acted a certain way. And those can be our values, and that, he says, that tends to be much more political, what we want and what we intend. Whereas economics is pretty much, well, what's actually going to happen and what's actually taking place, what will the facts and the evidence actually support. And he says that's much more an art of what's actually possible versus, again, a lot of wishful thinking, which, for some people that's hard to take, because again, we're at our heart mostly aspirational and idealistic. Number three, what mistake do people often make when weighing economic decisions and saving lives? Why is one life not actually of infinite worth? I thought this was a powerful section to read, given what we're dealing with right now in the lockdown and quarantine procedures, and even direct quotes from some politicians. Um, and again, what mistake do people often make is, he says, they make this statement that human life has infinite value. Now, again, we can talk about that in a spiritual sense and in the eyes of God and different things, but he says that, and again, you have a lot of people justifying complete lockdown or draconian measures of reopening and different things, because they're saying, if it's going to save a single human life, which has infinite worth, that's worth everything. Why would we care what our stock market is? Why do we care what the unemployment is? Why do we care if, the country's going into debt? Why, we can't weigh those things. You can't compare them with the value of a human life. And he says that's a mistake, because it blinds us to real costs. It blinds us to what it really costs. He doesn't necessarily say, it's not like, oh, well, no, humans aren't really that valuable and we're just another resource. But he says when we don't consider them that way, it actually causes us to misinterpret what we're actually losing. Because I don't think he would argue that saving lives is not a good goal, and that it's a noble goal, and it's maybe one of the higher goals. But he would say that when you don't consider human lives in the same equation, along with other factors in the economy, you're actually going to hurt that goal. And you might actually end up costing more human lives and hurting and deteriorating human lives rather than helping them, because you're trying to make decisions on non-economic values versus economic values and reality. Again, a developing argument right now is, again, the lives being lost to COVID-19 and the infections, which is in some sense alarming and definitely tragic. That they say, the real history of this, or interesting thing to play out, is look at the impact of the lockdowns in terms of what we did to save those human lives. Are we actually going to net save human lives, or are we going to actually cost human lives? When we look at COVID deaths versus, say, deaths of despair, people who, suicide rates, abuse rates within homes, um, people, mental health disorders, delays in healthcare, people who delayed, having heart attacks at home and not going in for chemotherapy, or even, again, a lot of supply chains. We're not even able to really calculate yet what the shutdown of our economy is having on the impact of people in other countries around the world to feed themselves, because now the ones at the lower end of our supply chains, we're not requiring those goods. Those people are losing their jobs, and they're in a much more dangerous situation as far as starving to death or losing their homes or not having a lot of supports to their health and their livelihoods. And so it'll be very interesting to see what the cost actually ends up being, um, in terms of some of these. I'm not the lockdowns. We don't know for sure yet, and hopefully it will be worth it. But he's saying when we go at it from the non-economic value and say, oh, saving one life makes everything worth it. It's not saying that life isn't worth it, but in thinking that way, you're liable actually to kill and hurt more people than you're actually saving. Um, and then he goes on to make the point that what actually tends to save lives, uh, you know, based on the statistics, is prosperity, wealth. That where wealth and increases, where people make more money, and where free markets are allowed to lift people out of poverty, that saves lives more than anything else. And that again, there's a difference between talking about and thinking, I want to save lives, and going about it one way versus saying, you know what, even though I might look like I care less about human lives by letting everybody out during COVID-19, you might actually be saving more lives. Or you might seem callous towards human life because you're a free marketer and you don't want all these social programs to help people. But in overall, by doing that, you're raising the overall society or other countries out of poverty, and you're saving more lives. What's saving people's lives are people economically prospering and allowing, he says, to have cleaner drinking water, to have better access to healthcare, to being able to build safer homes that can withstand natural disasters, or that can have savings so that they don't starve to death when there are recessions. And so that again, what looks compassionate versus what actually achieves the goal of compassion, which is helping people, he says those can be two very different things. And though economics can look like the dismal science that doesn't care about people, by only looking at considering what actually works in the numbers, not what you intend or wish would happen, you're actually going to save more lives. You're actually going to help people more. It's kind of like, it's just the concept of tough love, that something can look cruel and uncaring at first, but it actually might in the long run be doing a greater benefit. And so he says, why is one life not actually of infinite worth? Because it's not, no life is of infinite worth if it's costing other people their lives. If it's costing other people their lives, in saving one life, are we really not doing harm anywhere else? And he says, in a world where there are limited, scarce resources with alternative uses, if you devote all this energy, an infinite amount of resources, to save one or a certain life, or the lives of people within a certain group or country, you are, by definition of economics, taking resources from another place and possibly doing even more harm in those areas. And so again, these intentions are very dangerous things when we separate what we're making our decisions by away from pure economics, and instead get caught up in this idea of non-economic values. Number 4, what is wrong with controlling markets based on values? What does he say is often worse than economic greed? Why are leaving markets as free as possible actually the most moral option? The idea that, yes, the free market runs this way, but we need to control it because it should be better, or it's not right, or that's broken, and that's creating something we perceive as an injustice, or as a wrong, or as a moral wrong. And he says, why shouldn't we, jerry rig or control or modify or regulate our markets in order to achieve what we think is fair and right and good? And he says two things. One, what I've already been talking about, that when we do that, we tend to govern by intent rather than result. So we say we intend for this to happen, and we forget to ever check or answer the question, well, is it actually doing what we said it was going to do? Are we again, we want to save lives, we want to lift people out of poverty, but is our policy actually doing the opposite of what we're intending, which we've talked about all semester long? The other thing he points out is that this isn't, at its basis, the idea of I'm going to shape a market based on on values, is it's a power grab. Because what you're basically saying is, whose values are going to govern the market? Who's deciding the way that what is right? What constitutes equality? What constitutes fairness? Who deserves what? All these different questions. And so what you're doing when you're controlling a free market based on values is you are allowing one group, a third party, to impose its values on others. It's not allowing a free transaction between two willing parties. It's a third party, the government, coming in and saying, you cannot do this because we've decided that's immoral. You cannot do that because we've decided that that this is a harmful thing. And so you are imposing or limiting other people's options based on what you think. Now, obviously, that's allowed with externalities where you can prove that a transaction is harming the life, liberty, and virtue of another group. But he says in a lot of cases, it's simply one group saying, well, we're going to become it's our values that are going to be imposed upon other markets. And he says, in a sense, that's worse, because he says that is not a greed for wealth, which again, a lot of people target. Oh, it's so awful to be greedy and make money and to be consumed with greed for more material gain, which is true. Greed is an unhealthy thing. But he says what's even worse than that is a greed for power. And that a lot of times the arguments made for controlling markets based on values are actually people who have an intent, not greed necessarily just for money, but for control. And that has actually done far more harm to the human race and to civilizations than a greed for money, is the greed for power. And that, be careful when people talk about wanting to pass laws and regulations based on values, when a lot of times it's an imposition of third-party values and it's a power grab. And it's not maybe a lust for profits, corporate profits, but it's a lust for control. And then the last part, he says free markets are the best option or they're actually the most moral option, because to counter to what we just said in the first part, that one, a free market objectively helps people the most. That if we say we care about people, if we say we care about opportunity, if we care about equality, if we care about saving lives, that the free market generates the highest level of freedom. And again, we tracked the countries with the most economic freedom tended to have, the most prosperity. So that's moral. Again, if you really care about helping people, you probably should get rid of the minimum wage. Again, it sounds wrong. Doesn't sound like a good value. But if you actually cared about saving lives, we might decide, we should have let everybody out of the quarantine sooner. We should have done, or at least done something more like Sweden. We don't know. We'll find out. That's why nobody's necessarily to blame. But we have to consider and carefully weigh these things. The other thing is, he says it's more moral because the free market allows people to decide for themselves how they want to live. It's moral because it says, you know what, as long as we've got some basic laws that show what you're doing doesn't have an externality that's harming somebody else. Then if that's how you want to live, then I'm going to let you live out your values, and then you're going to let me live out my values. And that's what a free market is. It's not a valueless, soulless, heartless system that cares only about material money and greed and wealth and luxury. No, it's a market that has no morality, so that human beings and individual morality can be fully expressed, and people can actually just do what they want, and do and follow their own principles. Because again, going back to the first question, economics is not a value. And so what we want an economic system that doesn't set the values of our culture to anything other than, hey, let people live out their values. Let people live out as sovereign, free individuals. That's our value. And if some people that's to make a lot of money, well, then good luck with that. We'll see if they enjoy a life like that. If other people it's charity, then let them live out on charity. If other people it's, want to work here or whatever it is, it's moral because it's moral because it's amoral. In other words, it stays out of the moral realm, and it allows people the freedom to make the transactions and to exercise the values that they truly believe in. All right. Good stuff. Chapter 25, non-economic values.